I was wiping down the lunch tables in the school cafeteria when I noticed a student shoving her hand into the trash can. Sweetie, did you forget something? I asked, watching her eyes dart between me and the half-eaten trays. No, Miss Sunshine, she said quickly, clutching her backpack. Yesterday I watched her drink from an opened milk carton when she thought no one was looking. Miss Sunshine? She asked quietly. Does it count as stealing food if someone already threw it away? Why do you ask? I said carefully. Just seems wasteful. My mom always says waste is wrong. That's when another student passed by and dumped his tray of untouched chicken nuggets. Suddenly, Isabella's hand shot out and she took the remaining nuggets and tossed them into her bag. Isabella, I said gently. She froze, guilty tears already forming. I'm sorry. I'll put it back. It's okay. Come here, honey. I pulled her aside, away from the other students. How long have you been doing this? Her chin trembled. Since the eviction notice. That was 42 days ago. I counted. My chest tightened. 42 days? Mommy says counting helps when your tummy hurts. I'm really good at counting now. She said it like an achievement. Yesterday I made it to 8,000 before school started. That's when the hunger stops feeling sharp and just feels floaty. She was so thin her elbows looked too big for her frame. Isabella, can I see what's in your bag? She hesitated, then slowly opened it. 6 carefully wrapped bundles of cafeteria food. Some from today, some were moldy. This one's for tonight, she explained, pointing to a napkin-wrapped sandwich. This one's for Paul's breakfast tomorrow if we don't have anything. This one's emergency food in case Mommy can't get to the food bank before it closes again. She works 2 jobs now, so sometimes the timing is wrong. How often does Mommy make it to the food bank? She used to go every week, but then her car broke and the bus doesn't go there and it's too far to walk with groceries. Last time was, she counted on her fingers, 19 days ago. We made it last really long though. Mommy's really good at making a little bit stretch. I pulled out my phone, opening our school's emergency resource contact list. What other games does your family play? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The money game, Isabella said simply. Mommy gives all her paychecks to Rick, that's my stepdad. He says he's better at managing money because he's the man of the house. I felt my jaw tighten. Does your mom get to keep any of her paycheck? She tried once. Isabella's voice dropped to a whisper. She kept $40 to buy groceries. She paused, picking at her backpack strap. He was so mad. He threw all the dishes on the floor and Mommy had to pick up all the broken pieces with her hands. Some pieces were really sharp. Did your mom get hurt? Isabella nodded. She's good now, though. She knows not to break the rules. She gives Rick everything on payday. What does Rick do with the money? He goes to a place called a casino. He says one day he'll win big and we'll have so much food. She smiled like she believed it. Last week he came home with new boots and cigarettes. He said his luck is changing soon. But Mommy just cried in the bathroom. My hands trembled as I continued scrolling through emergency contacts. This wasn't just poverty. This was something much worse. Do your teachers know about this? No. Mommy says we have to be good at pretending or bad things happen. Paul's teacher sent him to the nurse once because he fell asleep in class. Now he pinches himself to stay awake. Paul's 6, right? Your little brother? The other students were filing out now, lunch period ending. Isabella looked panicked. I have to go to class. I made a decision. Isabella, I need you to stay here for a few extra minutes. I'm going to call the front office and let your teacher know you'll be a little late. Her eyes went wide with fear. Am I in trouble? Please don't call anyone, please. Mommy will be so upset. She's trying so hard. I want to make sure you and Paul and your mom get some help. Real help. But they'll take us away. As I was calling for help, Isabella grabbed my arm and whispered something that made my blood run cold. Turns out the eviction and the hunger weren't the real problem. She leaned in close and whispered in my ear. Her breath was warm, but her words made everything inside me turn to ice. She said Rick puts his hands around her mom's neck and squeezes until her mom can't breathe anymore. She said he does it almost every week now. Last time it happened, her mom's eyes rolled back and she stopped moving for so long that Isabella thought she was actually dead. She said she counted to 423 before her mom finally started breathing again. I felt my hands go completely cold. The cafeteria suddenly felt too bright and too loud. All this time I thought the food hoarding was the main problem. All this time I was focused on the hunger and the eviction. But those were just the things I could see. The real danger was happening behind closed doors where nobody could witness it. I looked down at Isabella's thin face and realized this child had been watching her mother get strangled unconscious, while also trying to keep herself and her little brother fed. I forced myself to take a slow breath and keep my voice calm. I told Isabella she was very brave for telling me this. I said I was going to make sure some adults who help families in trouble would talk to her mom. Her whole body went stiff. She grabbed my sleeve with both hands and pulled hard. She begged me not to call anyone. She said they would take her and Paul away forever, and she would never see her mom again. Her eyes filled with tears and she kept saying, please, please, please don't call. I gently took her hands off my sleeve and held them. I explained that my job as a teacher is to keep kids safe even when it feels scary. I told her that what Rick was doing to her mom was very dangerous, and we needed to get help right away. She started crying harder, but I kept holding her hands. I stood up and guided Isabella toward the cafeteria exit. The hallway was mostly empty now since lunch period had ended. I walked her down to the front office with my hand on her shoulder. The secretary looked up when we came in. I asked her to please watch Isabella for a few minutes while I talked to the principal about something important. The secretary nodded and offered Isabella a chair near her desk. I knocked on the principal's office door and went inside. My principal was working on her computer, but she looked up right away when she saw my face. I closed the door behind me and told her what Isabella had just disclosed. I said the words out loud for the first time. Strangulation. Multiple times. Mother stopped breathing. The principal's expression changed immediately. She stood up and pulled a thick binder off her shelf. It was labeled Mandated Reporter Protocol in red letters. She flipped it open and said we needed to call CPS right now. She told me to sit at her desk and write down every single thing Isabella had told me while it was still fresh in my memory. I sat down and pulled out a piece of paper. My hand was shaking as I started writing. I wrote about the 42 days of hunger, the eviction notice, Rick taking all the paychecks and spending them at the casino, the broken dishes and the mother's cut hands, the locked refrigerator, Paul pinching himself to stay awake in class. And then I got to the newest part. I wrote the words mother stopped breathing and my hands shook so hard I had to stop for a second. I knew from a training we had last year that strangulation is one of the biggest warning signs that domestic violence will turn deadly. When someone has been strangled even once, their risk of being killed by their abuser goes up by something like 700%. And Isabella said this had been happening almost every week. I finished writing everything down and handed the paper to my principal. She read it carefully and her jaw got tight. She picked up her phone and called our school social worker. She said we had an emergency situation and needed Rebecca to come to the office right away. Less than 5 minutes later, Rebecca walked in carrying a folder with emergency response written on the front. The principal handed her my notes and Rebecca read through them quickly. She asked me specific questions about timing. How long ago did the last strangulation happen? How often does it occur? Are there visible injuries on the mother right now? I answered everything I could remember from what Isabella had told me. Rebecca nodded and said this definitely met the threshold for an immediate CPS report. She said the combination of severe neglect and repeated strangulation meant we had to act fast. Rebecca pulled out her phone and dialed the CPS hotline number. She put it on speaker so we could all hear. A woman answered and asked for the reason for the call. Rebecca gave Isabella's full name and date of birth. She provided the home address and described both kids. She explained about the food insecurity that had been going on for 42 days. She described Rick's complete financial control and his gambling problem. She talked about the broken dishes incident where the mother got cut. Then she got to the strangulation part. She said the stepfather has been choking the mother unconscious approximately once per week for an unknown period of time. She said during the most recent incident the mother stopped breathing for several minutes. The intake worker asked if there were visible injuries right now. Rebecca said the child reported purple fingerprints on the mother's neck that she covers with scarves. The worker asked about the children's current safety. Rebecca explained both kids were at the school right now, but would need to go home in about 3 hours when school let out. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the intake worker said their office was dealing with really high caseload numbers right now. She said they would likely be able to respond within 72 hours unless there was an immediate life-threatening situation happening right this second. My stomach dropped. 72 hours meant 3 whole days. 3 days where Isabella and Paul would go home to a house where their mom was getting strangled unconscious. 3 days where anything could happen. But the worker said she was flagging our report as high priority because of the strangulation disclosure. She said a caseworker would be assigned today and would try to make contact as soon as possible. Rebecca thanked her and hung up. She looked at me and the principal and said we should bring in our school resource officer to look at this from a law enforcement angle. The principal called down to Amos Graham's office. He showed up about 10 minutes later in his uniform. Rebecca summarized everything for him while he listened with his arms crossed. When she got to the strangulation part, his whole face changed. He said that in our state, non-fatal strangulation is a felony charge. He explained that law enforcement treats it as one of the strongest predictors that a domestic violence situation will end in murder. He said when someone survives being strangled, they're at extremely high risk of being killed by the same person later. I stood up and said I wanted to take Isabella to the nurse to make sure she wasn't hurt. Amos nodded and said that was a good idea. I walked back out to the front office where Isabella was sitting with the secretary. I told her we were going to visit the nurse for a quick check. She looked scared, but she came with me. The nurse's office was down another hallway. I explained to the nurse that we needed to do a gentle exam to check for any injuries. The nurse was really kind about it. She asked Isabella to stand up and slowly looked at her arms, legs, and neck. She asked if Isabella had any bruises or places that hurt. Isabella shook her head. The nurse checked her skin carefully. There were no bruises or marks on Isabella's body. But then Isabella said something that made my chest hurt. She said her mom has purple fingerprints on her neck right now. She said her mom wears scarves and turtleneck shirts to cover them up so nobody will see. The nurse wrote this down in her notes. She also measured Isabella's height and weight. She recorded that Isabella showed signs of significant weight loss and malnutrition for her age. Then the nurse opened a drawer and pulled out a granola bar and a small juice box. She handed them to Isabella with a smile. Isabella took them and immediately asked if she could save them for Paul. She said Paul didn't get breakfast this morning and would be really hungry after school. My heart broke all over again watching this little girl think about her brother before herself, even when someone was trying to give her food. I thanked the nurse and walked Isabella back toward the front office where I'd left my phone. The emergency contact form listed a cell number for her mom. I pulled it up and pressed call. 2 rings, then straight to voicemail. A generic automated voice told me to leave a message. I kept my tone light and professional, saying I was Isabella's teacher and wanted to discuss some school matters when she had a chance to call back. I didn't mention CPS or anything Isabella told me because I had no idea if Rick checked her mom's phone. When I hung up, Isabella was watching me with wide eyes. Before I could say anything, Rebecca appeared in the hallway carrying a small canvas bag. She motioned for me to step aside. Rebecca opened the bag and showed me about a dozen granola bars, crackers, and juice boxes. She told me to keep these in my desk drawer. Then she explained a code word system. If Isabella ever said the phrase, "I forgot my library book," it meant she needed immediate help. Rebecca said kids in dangerous homes need ways to signal problems without anyone else knowing what they're really saying. That way, if someone dangerous overhears, it just sounds like a normal school thing. I took the bag and nodded. Rebecca squeezed my shoulder and said she'd check in with me tomorrow. I walked Isabella back to my classroom. The other students were already in their seats working on math worksheets. Isabella's empty desk sat in the second row. I bent down next to her and spoke quietly. I told her that some people who help families would probably want to talk to her mom soon. I said she did nothing wrong by telling me the truth. She nodded but kept her eyes on the floor. I watched her shoulders curl inward like she was trying to make herself smaller. The protective shell she'd built was sliding back into place. I sent her to her desk and tried to focus on teaching for the rest of the afternoon, but my mind kept drifting to purple fingerprints and locked refrigerators. After the final bell rang and the buses pulled away, I walked to the principal's office. Rebecca was already there with a yellow legal pad covered in notes. The three of us sat around the conference table. Rebecca said we needed a safety plan for tomorrow and however long it took for CPS to respond. The principal agreed. We decided I would check on Isabella first thing every morning before class started. Rebecca would provide breakfast and lunch supplements that I could give her discreetly. I would document any new things Isabella told me and any concerning behaviors I noticed. The principal said to email her and Rebecca immediately if anything seemed urgent. Rebecca reminded us that we'd done our legal duty by reporting to CPS, and now we had to let the system work. But sitting in that conference room making plans for tomorrow felt like putting a tiny band-aid on a huge wound. That evening, I sat on my couch trying to watch TV but couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about Isabella counting to 8,000 to make hunger feel floaty instead of sharp. I thought about her mom's neck covered in bruises hidden under scarves. I thought about 6-year-old Paul pinching himself to stay awake in class. Around 8 o'clock, I picked up my phone and called Rebecca's cell. She answered after 3 rings. I asked if we'd done enough. Rebecca was quiet for a second, then said we'd done everything we were legally and ethically required to do. She said the system has procedures and timelines and we have to trust it to respond the right way. I wanted to believe her, but 72 hours felt like forever when someone was getting strangled unconscious every week. The next morning, Isabella showed up 20 minutes before school started. I was in my classroom setting up for the day when I saw her through the window walking across the parking lot. She had her backpack on, the same one full of hoarded cafeteria food. When she came through my door, she looked exhausted. Dark circles sat under her eyes like bruises. Her hair wasn't brushed. She walked to her desk and sat down without saying anything. I pulled a breakfast bar from the bag Rebecca gave me and brought it over. I asked how she was doing, using the same casual voice I'd use with any student on any normal morning. She took the bar and said she was fine. Then she immediately asked if we were doing art today. I recognized what she was doing. She was trying to establish normal, trying to control something in a life where she controlled almost nothing. I told her yes, we'd do art after lunch. She nodded and carefully unwrapped the breakfast bar. During morning announcements, I stood by my classroom door and watched the hallway. Paul's teacher walked past with Paul shuffling beside her. His head kept drooping forward. They turned toward the nurse's office. I stepped into the hall and caught up with them. I said Paul's family was going through some hard times right now, and our social worker was working on getting them support services. His teacher nodded and said she'd noticed he seemed more tired than usual lately. I went back to my classroom where Isabella sat drawing on scrap paper while the other kids filtered in. At lunch, Isabella came to my table in the cafeteria carrying her tray and her backpack. She sat down and pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket. She unfolded it and showed me a drawing she'd made with crayons. The drawing showed a refrigerator with a big silver lock on the door. She explained in a flat voice that Rick put the lock on 3 weeks ago after he caught her taking an apple she wasn't supposed to have. She said only Rick has the key now. She said they can only eat what he decides to give them and when he decides to give it. I stared at the drawing. A locked fridge with 2 hungry kids in the house. I asked if I could take a picture of her drawing. She nodded. I pulled out my phone and took a photo, making sure the padlock was clearly visible. Then I opened my messages and sent it to Rebecca with a short explanation about what Isabella just told me. Rebecca responded in less than 5 minutes. She said she was adding it to the documentation file. She said she'd contacted a food bank coordinator who would put together an emergency pantry bag. The bag would be delivered to the school, and Isabella could take it home today. I showed Isabella the message. For the first time that day, something like hope flickered across her face. During my planning period that afternoon, my phone buzzed with Rebecca's name on the screen. She said she'd arranged for someone named Larissa Alvarado to meet with us, a domestic violence advocate from the county office who worked specifically with strangulation cases. Rebecca explained that Larissa could help us understand the real danger level and what safety planning needed to happen while we waited for CPS to respond. I felt my stomach tighten because bringing in a strangulation specialist meant this was even more serious than I'd realized. Rebecca said the meeting was set for after school today in the conference room, and that she'd already pulled Amos in too since he needed to understand the law enforcement angle. I spent the rest of my planning period trying to focus on grading papers, but my eyes kept drifting to the clock. At 3:15, I walked down to the conference room where Rebecca and Amos were already waiting. A woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back sat at the table with a thick binder open in front of her. Rebecca introduced her as Larissa, and we all sat down. Larissa didn't waste time with small talk. She opened her binder to a page covered in statistics, and said that strangulation was the #1 predictor that an abuser would eventually kill their victim. She looked directly at each of us as she explained that when someone had been strangled to unconsciousness multiple times, the risk of homicide increased by 750%. She said we needed to treat the situation as life-threatening, not just as another domestic violence case. Amos leaned forward and asked about the legal side, and Larissa explained that non-fatal strangulation was a felony in our state, specifically because of how often it led to murder. She said the fact that Isabella's mother had been strangled unconscious multiple times put her in the highest risk category possible. My hands felt cold as I listened. Larissa pulled out a questionnaire and started asking detailed questions about the family's patterns. She wanted to know when Rick typically gambled, when the mother worked, when the kids were usually home alone. I shared what Isabella had told me about Rick going to the casino on payday Thursdays, and sometimes staying out all night. I mentioned the mother working 2 jobs with schedules that seemed to change a lot. Larissa wrote everything down, then asked about the financial control, the locked refrigerator, the phone monitoring that the mother had hinted at. She said abusers who controlled every aspect of their victim's life were the most dangerous because they saw their partners as property, not people. Rebecca added details about the food hoarding, Paul's exhaustion, the bruises Isabella described on her mother's neck. Larissa nodded and said all of this fit the pattern of severe coercive control. She explained that the gambling addiction made Rick even more unpredictable, because he'd be most violent when he lost money, which was probably most of the time. The meeting lasted almost an hour, and by the end, Larissa had filled 6 pages with notes. She said she'd reach out to the mother through the domestic violence hotline, which offered anonymous counseling that Rick couldn't trace. She told us not to call the mother directly anymore, because if Rick found evidence of outside contact, he might escalate the violence or flee with the family. After Larissa left, I sat in the conference room feeling overwhelmed. Rebecca touched my shoulder and reminded me we were doing everything possible within the system's limits. I went back to my classroom and pulled out my phone. I knew Larissa said not to call, but I needed to try one more time. I dialed the mother's number during my planning period the next day. This time someone answered after 3 rings. Before I could say anything beyond my name, a woman's voice whispered urgently that I shouldn't call this number again because he checked her phone. Then the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. That whispered warning confirmed everything we feared about Rick monitoring her communications. I immediately texted Rebecca about the call, and she responded that she'd add it to the documentation. The next morning, I took attendance and Isabella's seat sat empty. I felt panic rise in my chest as I counted through the roster twice, hoping I'd somehow missed her name. I walked straight to the front office and told the secretary that Isabella wasn't here, and I needed to speak with Rebecca right away. The secretary checked the absence log and confirmed no one had called in for Isabella, which she noted was unusual even for families going through hard times. Rebecca arrived within minutes, and we went into the principal's office together. Rebecca called the front desk at CPS and provided an update about the missed school day, explaining that this was the first unexplained absence since we'd filed the report. The CPS worker on the phone said they had Isabella's case flagged as high priority and would note the absence in their file. An hour into first period, I was teaching a math lesson when I saw movement through my classroom window. Paul walked across the parking lot with his mother, who had her head down and was moving quickly toward the entrance. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, watching as Paul's teacher met them at the door. The mother handed Paul off without coming inside, then hurried back to her car. I walked over to Paul's teacher, who was kneeling down talking to him. She looked up at me and quietly said Paul was wearing the same clothes as yesterday, and that his mother mentioned they'd had car trouble this morning. But then Paul had whispered to her that they actually slept in the car in a parking lot because Rick came home angry last night. My chest felt tight as I listened. I thanked her for telling me and went straight back to call Rebecca. Rebecca listened to everything, then immediately got on the phone with CPS again. She provided another update about the family sleeping in their car, and Paul's disclosure about Rick coming home angry. The CPS worker said they were elevating the case priority based on all these accumulating risk factors. They scheduled a home visit for tomorrow afternoon and said they'd coordinate with police for safety. I went back to teaching but couldn't focus. Just before lunch period, I saw Isabella walking up the front steps with her mother. The mother looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her shoulders hunched forward. She wouldn't make eye contact with the secretary or any staff members. I met them in the hallway and the mother looked at me briefly, her lips forming the words, "I'm sorry," before she turned and left quickly. Isabella stood there with her backpack, looking down at her shoes. I gently touched her shoulder and asked if she was okay. She nodded but didn't speak. Then she reached into her pocket and pressed a tiny folded piece of paper into my palm before walking toward the cafeteria. I waited until she was gone, then unfolded the note. In careful pencil letters, it said, "Don't call at night. Only morning before 7. I took a photo of the note and walked straight to Rebecca's office. She pulled up the CPS case file on her computer and said she was filing a supplemental report right now. She typed quickly, documenting the strangulation pattern, the phone monitoring, the family sleeping in the car, and now this note showing a child trying to establish safe communication windows. She said all of this painted a picture of a family living in constant fear and trying to survive. That afternoon, Rebecca's phone rang while I was in her office discussing the food bank delivery. She answered and put it on speaker. Larissa's voice came through saying she'd reached out to the mother through a domestic violence hotline counselor who made contact during one of the mother's work breaks. The mother had broken down crying on the phone and admitted she was scared to leave because Rick had threatened to kill her and take the kids where she'd never find them if she tried to escape. Larissa said this was a classic threat used by abusers to maintain control, and that it showed how trapped the mother felt. She said the mother was interested in learning about shelter options, but was worried about losing her jobs and having no way to support the kids. Larissa explained that she'd given the hotline counselor information about employment assistance and shelter programs, and that the counselor would follow up again tomorrow during the mother's lunch break. Rebecca thanked Larissa, and we sat in silence after the call ended. I felt the weight of everything pressing down, all these pieces of a family falling apart while we tried to catch them before they hit the ground. Larissa spent the next hour explaining how everything we'd documented fit together into a pattern she'd seen dozens of times before. Financial abuse meant the mother had no money to leave, no way to rent an apartment or buy food if she walked out. Isolation meant she probably had no family nearby, no friends Rick hadn't driven away, no support system to help her escape. Monitoring her phone meant she couldn't reach out for help without him knowing. The threats about taking the kids meant even if she found the courage to leave, she'd be too scared he'd follow through and she'd lose them forever. Larissa said the mother told the hotline counselor she wanted information about shelters, but kept asking how she'd keep her jobs if she moved across town, how she'd afford anything without access to her own paychecks, how she'd protect the kids if Rick found them. Every question showed how trapped she felt, how the abuse had convinced her there was no way out that didn't end in disaster. The next morning, I stood by the front entrance watching for Isabella, and when she walked up the steps, I noticed immediately how she tugged her sleeve down over her left arm. She saw me looking and pulled the fabric even lower, bunching it in her fist. I walked over and asked if everything was okay at home last night. She nodded quickly, too quickly, and said everything was fine. I gently touched her shoulder and asked if I could see her arm. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything, just slowly pushed up her sleeve to show me a dark purple bruise circling her forearm like a bracelet. I asked what happened, and she said she bumped into a door, but her voice broke on the word door, and the tears spilled over. I told her it was okay, that I just wanted to make sure she was safe, and she wiped her eyes with her other hand and whispered that she couldn't talk about it. I walked her straight to the nurse's office and explained that Isabella had a bruise we needed to document. The nurse asked Isabella to sit on the exam table and carefully examined her arm, taking several photos from different angles with the school's medical documentation camera. She measured the bruise with a small ruler and wrote down the measurements in Isabella's file. Then she asked Isabella to tell her what happened, and Isabella repeated the door story, but the nurse was already shaking her head slightly while writing notes. After Isabella left for class, the nurse showed me what she'd written in the medical file. The bruise pattern showed 4 distinct oval marks on the inside of Isabella's forearm, and 1 larger mark on the outside, perfectly positioned where an adult's fingers and thumb would grip if they grabbed a child's arm hard enough to leave marks. The nurse wrote that the injury was not consistent with bumping into a door, that the pattern indicated forceful gripping by an adult hand, and that she was adding this observation to Isabella's growing medical record of concerning findings. During lunch period, I sat with Isabella while she ate, and she seemed quieter than usual, picking at her food instead of eating quickly like she normally did. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a crumpled envelope with a casino logo printed across the front. She smoothed it out on the table and pointed to Rick's name printed above the address. She explained that these came in the mail every single week, sometimes twice a week, with special offers for free drinks or bonus slot machine credits. She said Rick usually went to the casino on Thursday nights after he got paid from his construction job, and that he wouldn't come home until Friday morning, sometimes losing his whole paycheck before the weekend even started. Last Thursday, he came home at 6 in the morning with no money and no groceries, and her mom had cried in the bathroom for an hour before she had to leave for her first job. Isabella said Thursday nights were the worst, because they never knew if he'd come home angry about losing or drunk or both. But at least while he was gone, the house felt safer for a few hours. I took several photos of the envelope with my phone, making sure Rick's name and the casino logo were clearly visible. Then I walked straight to Rebecca's office and showed her the photos along with the nurse's documentation of Isabella's bruise. Rebecca pulled out her phone and called Amos, asking him to come to her office right away. When he arrived 5 minutes later, I explained the Thursday night casino pattern while Rebecca pulled up a calendar on her computer. Amos studied the photos and said this pattern gave them a potential window when the mother would be home alone with the kids, when they could attempt a welfare check without Rick present to interfere or intimidate her. He said if they coordinated the timing right, officers could make contact with her during those few hours when she might feel safe enough to talk honestly about what was happening. Rebecca nodded and said she was calling CPS immediately to share this new information. Rebecca put her phone on speaker and called the CPS worker assigned to the case. She explained about Isabella's bruise and the nurse's documentation, that it was consistent with an adult grab mark, not a door bump like Isabella claimed. Then she described the Thursday night casino pattern and suggested that evening would be the best time for a home visit when Rick would likely be out gambling. The CPS worker said she was adding the injury documentation to the case file and agreed that Thursday evening was optimal timing for their visit. She said she'd coordinate with the police department to have officers conduct a welfare check at the same time, which would give them legal grounds to enter the home if they had any safety concerns about the family's well-being. The CPS worker said the plan was set for this Thursday at 7 in the evening and that she'd call Rebecca afterward to report what they found. Thursday arrived and I couldn't focus on anything except watching the clock. I taught my afternoon classes on autopilot, checking my phone every few minutes even though I knew the welfare check wasn't scheduled until 7. I drove home and made dinner but couldn't eat, just sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone. 7 o'clock came and went. 7:30. 8 o'clock. By 8:15, I was pacing around my apartment, imagining every possible scenario. Finally, at 8:30, my phone buzzed with a text from Amos. He said they'd made contact with the mother, that Rick was confirmed to be out of the house, but that the visit hadn't gone the way they'd hoped. He said he'd call me in a few minutes to explain. When Amos called, he said the mother had answered the door looking terrified when she saw police uniforms. She kept glancing over her shoulder and asking them to please leave before Rick came home. The officers explained they were there to check on the family's safety and asked if they could come inside to talk. The mother let them in but wouldn't sit down, just stood by the door wringing her hands, and saying over and over that Rick would know they'd been there, that he'd be able to tell somehow, that he always knew when she did something behind his back. The CPS worker asked about the children's well-being, and the mother insisted they were fine, that everything was fine, that they just needed to leave right now. One officer noticed bruises on the mother's neck partially hidden by her collar, and asked her to explain how she got them. The mother pulled her collar higher and said she didn't remember. Maybe she bumped into something. The officer also documented bruises circling both her wrists like bracelets, matching the pattern on Isabella's arm. When they suggested the mother could leave right then with the kids, that they could take her somewhere safe, she started crying and begging them to go before Rick returned. She said if they took her away, he'd find her and kill her, that he'd promised he would, that she believed him completely. The officers gave her a domestic violence resource card, but she refused to take it, said Rick would find it and know she'd talk to police. So one officer tucked the card inside a grocery store receipt and handed her that instead, hoping she could hide it somewhere Rick wouldn't look. They took photos of her visible injuries and documented her fear and her statements before leaving, respecting her stated wishes while making sure everything was recorded in their report. Friday morning, I arrived at the school early and checked the attendance list. Isabella was marked absent. I walked down to Paul's classroom and saw him curled up on the floor in the hallway outside his room, sound asleep before the first bell even rang. His teacher was kneeling beside him, gently shaking his shoulder to wake him up. Paul's eyes opened slowly, and he looked confused about where he was. His teacher helped him stand and asked if he was okay. Paul said they didn't sleep at all last night because Rick was really mad about something, that he kept yelling and throwing things until almost morning, and that Paul was too scared to close his eyes until the sun came up. I went straight to Rebecca's office and told her Isabella was absent, and Paul had just disclosed another sleepless night with Rick angry and violent. Rebecca immediately called CPS and reported the absence following the welfare check, expressing concern that Rick may have discovered the police visit and retaliated against the family. The CPS worker listened to everything and said she was escalating the case to emergency status, based on the pattern of abuse, the fresh injuries, the mother's visible fear, and now the concerning absence right after police contact. She said they were attempting another home visit today, this time with police escort and authorization for emergency removal of the children, if they determined the kids were in immediate danger. I spent the rest of the morning checking my phone every few minutes and watching the front entrance through my classroom window whenever I could. At 10:30, Rebecca texted me that CPS was still attempting to reach the mother by phone, but hadn't made contact yet. At 10:45, the principal came by my room and asked if I'd seen Isabella or Paul arrive, and I told her no. Both kids were still marked absent. Then at 11 o'clock, I looked out the window during a math lesson and saw the mother's car pull into the parking lot. I watched her get out, then opened the back doors to help both kids climb out. All three of them moved slowly toward the building like they were walking through deep water. The mother was limping on her right side and kept one hand pressed against her ribs. Isabella held Paul's hand and kept looking back at the parking lot like she expected someone to follow them. I told my class to work on their worksheets and stepped into the hallway, meeting Rebecca, who'd also seen them arrive. We walked to the front office together and got there just as the mother came through the doors with both kids. Her left wrist had dark purple bruises circling it like a bracelet, and when she pushed her hair back, I could see the edge of another bruise on her neck that her collar didn't quite cover. She asked the secretary if she could speak to the principal privately, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her words. The secretary nodded and called the principal's office while Rebecca gently guided the mother toward the conference room. I knelt down next to Isabella and Paul and asked if they wanted to wait in my classroom where I had some books and coloring supplies. Isabella shook her head and whispered that they needed to stay close to their mom. So I brought them to the chairs outside the principal's office and sat with them while we waited. Paul curled up in his chair and closed his eyes immediately, exhausted from another sleepless night. Isabella sat rigid and alert, watching every person who walked past. The principal came out and invited the mother into her office, then looked at me and Rebecca and asked us to join them. I squeezed Isabella's shoulder and told her I'd be right back, then followed everyone inside. The principal closed the door and offered the mother a chair, but she stayed standing near the door like she might need to run. Rebecca started to ask how she was doing, but the mother interrupted and said she needed to show us something before she lost her nerve. She rolled up her left sleeve all the way to her elbow, revealing not just the wrist bruises but a fresh burn mark on her forearm about the size of a quarter, red and blistered around the edges. She said Rick found the card, the one the police gave her hidden in the grocery receipt. She said he came home early from wherever he'd been and started going through her purse looking for cigarette money. He found the receipt and saw the domestic violence hotline number written on it. The mother's voice dropped to barely a whisper as she described how Rick grabbed her arm and held his lit cigarette against her skin while he asked her if she'd called the police on him. She said she told him no, that she would never do that. But he didn't believe her. He said if he ever found out she talked to anyone, if anyone from CPS or police or school ever came around asking questions, He would take the kids and disappear to somewhere she'd never find them. He said he knew people in other states who would help him, that she'd spend the rest of her life wondering if her kids were alive or dead. The mother started crying as she talked, tears running down her face but her voice staying quiet and controlled like she'd practiced keeping her emotions small. Rebecca asked if Rick hurt her anywhere else, and the mother lifted her shirt slightly to show bruises on her ribs where he'd kicked her after she fell. The principal immediately picked up her phone and asked if the mother wanted her to call the police right now, but the mother shook her head violently and said, "No police. He'd know. He always knew somehow." Rebecca stepped out of the room and I heard her making a quick phone call in the hallway. She came back less than a minute later and said Larissa was on her way and would be here in 20 minutes. The mother looked panicked and asked who Larissa was, and Rebecca explained that Larissa works with families dealing with domestic violence and knows all about safety planning and legal protections. The mother said she couldn't stay long because she was supposed to be at work, and Rick would check her location on her phone. Rebecca gently suggested the mother could say she had to bring the kids to the school because they were sick, and that we could provide a note from the nurse if needed. The mother nodded slowly and sat down in the chair, finally letting herself rest for a moment. I asked if she wanted some water or coffee, and she said water would be good. I left to get it and checked on Isabella and Paul in the hallway. Isabella asked if her mom was okay, and I told her yes, that some adults were helping figure out how to make things better. When I came back with the water, Larissa was already walking through the front doors, even though it had only been 15 minutes. She must have dropped everything and driven straight here. Rebecca brought her to the conference room and introduced her to the mother, and Larissa sat down across from her with this calm, steady presence that seemed to fill the whole room. Larissa asked the mother to tell her what happened, and the mother went through the whole story again, showing the burn mark and the bruises. Larissa listened without interrupting, taking notes on a small pad. When the mother finished, Larissa said that what Rick did was criminal assault, that the threats he made were terroristic threats under state law, and that keeping food locked away from children were child endangerment. She said there were legal protections available right now, today, including emergency protective orders that could be issued within hours. She said there was a shelter across town that had open beds and could take the whole family immediately, with childcare services and help maintaining employment. The mother listened to all of this, and I could see her face going through different emotions, hope and fear and doubt all mixed together. She said she couldn't afford to miss work because she'd lose both jobs, and then how would she support the kids? She said the shelter was too far from where she worked, and she didn't have a car that ran reliably enough to make that drive twice a day. Larissa explained that the shelter had a van that provided transportation to and from work, and that they had staff who specialized in helping residents keep their jobs during the transition. The mother said, "But you don't understand. He'll find us. He always finds a way. He has friends everywhere, and he'll drive around until he sees my car or sees the kids somewhere." Larissa said the shelter location was completely confidential and not listed in any public records, that residents were instructed on safety protocols, that there were security cameras and locked entry systems. The mother kept shaking her head and saying, "He'll find us. He'll kill me. He promised he would kill me if I ever left." Larissa let her talk through all her fears without trying to argue or convince her, just listening and acknowledging how scary this was. Then Larissa said that staying was also dangerous, maybe more dangerous, especially with the strangulation history. She said the mother didn't have to decide anything right this second, but that the offer was there and the beds were being held. While this meeting was happening, I went back out to check on Isabella and Paul. It was almost lunchtime, and I asked if they wanted to come to the cafeteria with me. Paul was still sleeping in his chair, but Isabella said okay. We walked down to the cafeteria together, and I got her a tray of food. The hot lunch that day was chicken and rice. Isabella sat at an empty table and started eating, and I sat across from her trying to think of something normal to say. Then Isabella reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She slid it across the table to me without saying anything. I opened it and read the words written in her careful handwriting. "He says we're moving this weekend. Somewhere far away. I don't want to go." My hands went cold holding that note because this wasn't just Rick being controlling anymore. This was him planning to run, to take these kids somewhere we couldn't follow. I asked Isabella when he said this, and she said last night after he got home. She said he told her and Paul to start packing their important stuff because they were going on a trip and wouldn't be coming back. She said he seemed excited about it, like it was going to be an adventure, but she knew it wasn't a good thing. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket, then told Isabella to finish eating while I went to talk to Rebecca. I found Rebecca still in the conference room with the mother and Larissa, and I asked if I could speak with them for just 1 minute. I showed them the note and watched both Rebecca and Larissa's faces change as they read it. Larissa said this was a significant flight risk, that abusers often tried to isolate their victims further when they felt outside pressure closing in. Rebecca said we needed to contact CPS immediately and see if they could expedite their response. Larissa pulled out her phone and stepped into the hallway to make a call. She came back 5 minutes later and said she'd spoken with the CPS supervisor and requested an emergency team decision meeting. She explained that a TDM was a multi-agency meeting that could happen within 24 hours when a child was at imminent risk of serious harm or when there was significant flight risk. She said the supervisor agreed this met the criteria and was setting it up for tomorrow morning at 9. The meeting would include CPS, police, domestic violence advocates, school representatives, and hopefully the mother if she felt safe participating. The mother looked overwhelmed by all of this and said she didn't know if she could take off work tomorrow morning. Larissa said this was about keeping her kids safe and that most employers would understand, and that Larissa could provide documentation if needed. Rebecca said she would spend the rest of the afternoon pulling together all our documentation, everything from my initial notes to the nurse's records, to photos of the injuries and the drawing Isabella made of the locked refrigerator. She said she'd compile attendance records and all the supplemental reports we'd filed. The mother asked what would happen at this meeting, and Larissa explained they would develop a safety plan, figure out the best way to protect the children while respecting the mother's choices as much as possible. The mother said okay, she would try to be there, and then she said she really needed to get to work now, or she'd be in trouble. Larissa gave her a card with a phone number on it and said if anything changed, if the mother needed help before tomorrow morning, she could call that number anytime, day or night. The mother took the card and stared at it for a long moment, then tucked it deep into her pocket where it wouldn't be easily found. She collected Isabella and Paul from the hallway, and I walked them out to their car. Before she got in, the mother looked at me and mouthed the words, "Thank you," and I nodded because I didn't trust myself to speak without crying. The rest of the afternoon felt like moving through fog. I taught my classes and graded papers and responded to parent emails, but my mind kept circling back to that note about moving this weekend. At 3 o'clock, I met with Rebecca in her office, and she showed me the file she'd compiled. It was thick with documentation, page after page of evidence showing the pattern of abuse and neglect. She said she'd already sent it electronically to the CPS worker and would bring hard copies to the TDM tomorrow. I asked what happened if the mother didn't show up tomorrow, and Rebecca said the meeting would happen anyway, and they'd make decisions based on the information they had. I went home that evening but couldn't settle into anything, couldn't watch TV or read or even eat dinner. I kept checking my phone like I was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. Then at 7:30, my phone buzzed with a text from the school's main office number. It was just 3 words, but they made my heart start racing. Library book emergency. I knew immediately this was the code word Larissa had given the mother, the signal that she needed help right now. I called Rebecca, and she said she'd already gotten the same text and was calling Larissa and Amos. She said Larissa had established a predetermined meeting location for exactly this situation, a 24-hour grocery store parking lot about 10 minutes from the school. She said Larissa and Amos were heading there now and asked if I wanted to come. I said yes and grabbed my keys and drove to the grocery store probably faster than I should have. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw Amos's patrol car already there, parked near the entrance under the bright lights. Larissa's car was next to it. I parked nearby and walked over just as the mother's car pulled in. She parked and got out, and I could see both kids in the back seat, still in their school clothes from this morning. The mother walked over to where Larissa and Amos were standing, and she looked terrified but also determined in a way I hadn't seen before. Larissa asked what happened, and the mother said Rick came home drunk about an hour ago, drunker than usual, and he told the kids to start packing their stuff right now because they were leaving tonight. She said he was stumbling around throwing things into garbage bags and talking about how they'd be gone before anyone could stop them. She said she waited until he passed out on the couch, and then she grabbed the kids and left. She said she didn't take anything except her purse and the kids, that everything else was still at the house. Larissa said that was exactly the right thing to do, that she could replace stuff, but she couldn't replace her safety or her children's safety. She said the shelter had beds ready right now, and a volunteer driver was already on the way to escort them there. The mother asked how long it would take, and Larissa said less than 30 minutes. Amos asked if the mother wanted to file a police report about the assault and the threats, and the mother hesitated, but then said yes, she would do it. She was ready. Amos pulled out his notepad and started taking her statement right there in the parking lot under the fluorescent lights. He documented the burn mark and the bruises, took photos with his phone, wrote down everything the mother said about Rick's threats to take the kids and disappear. Within 20 minutes, a small van pulled into the parking lot with a woman driving who Larissa introduced as the shelter volunteer. The mother transferred the kids' car seats to the van, while Isabella and Paul watched with wide, scared eyes. I knelt down next to Isabella and told her she was being so brave, that she was going somewhere safe now where there would be food and beds and people who would help her mom. Isabella hugged me quickly, and then climbed into the van next to Paul. The mother got in last and looked back at all of us standing there, and I saw something in her face that might have been hope, or might have been terror, or might have been both. Then the van pulled away, and I watched its taillights disappear into the night. I barely slept that night, kept waking up every hour to check my phone. The next morning, I got to the school at 7 and found an email from Rebecca sent at 6:30. It said the family made it to the shelter safely overnight, that they'd been given a private room with 2 beds and access to the kitchen and common areas, that the mother had already met with the shelter advocate to start working on next steps. The email said the emergency TDM was still happening as scheduled at 9, even though the immediate crisis had been resolved, because they needed to develop a longer-term safety plan. I taught my first 2 classes in a daze, barely able to focus on the lessons. At 8:45, Rebecca came to get me, and we walked together to the conference room where the meeting was being held. The CPS worker was already there, along with Larissa, Amos, the principal, and 2 other people I didn't know who introduced themselves as the CPS supervisor and a police detective who specialized in domestic violence cases. The mother arrived a few minutes later, brought by the shelter advocate, and she looked exhausted, but also calmer than I'd seen her in weeks. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours. Everyone went through their documentation, and the CPS worker explained that they were opening a case that would remain active for at least 6 months with regular check-ins. They said the children could remain with their mother at the shelter as long as the mother continued engaging with services and following the safety plan. The plan included the protective order that was filed today, mandatory counseling for the whole family, continued coordination with the school, and regular meetings with the shelter case manager. The mother agreed to everything and signed all the papers they put in front of her. When the meeting finally ended, the mother came over to where I was sitting and thanked me for not giving up on her kids. She said she was sorry it took so long for her to be ready to leave, and I told her there was nothing to be sorry for, that she'd done an incredibly brave thing, and her kids were lucky to have her. She smiled at that, a real smile, and then the shelter advocate took her back to begin the next phase of their journey towards safety. By morning, Rebecca called to say CPS was already at the courthouse filing emergency paperwork for a protective order. The caseworker had compiled everything from the night before, including photos of the mother's injuries, the children's statements, documentation of the financial abuse, and the planned flight risk. Rebecca said the judge would review it within hours, because strangulation cases got priority treatment in family court. I taught my classes that morning, barely able to focus on the lesson plans. Around 11:30, Rebecca texted that the judge had granted the emergency order, and police were heading to serve Rick at the house right now. The order prohibited any contact with the mother or children, and required Rick to stay at least 500 feet away from them, the shelter, the school, and both of the mother's workplaces. I felt something release in my chest, knowing there was now a legal barrier between Rick and that family. The relief lasted exactly 2 hours. Just after lunch, the main office phone started ringing constantly. The secretary came to my classroom looking stressed and said Rick had called 6 times demanding to know where his wife and kids were. He'd threatened to sue the school, threatened to file complaints against every staff member involved, said we had no right to interfere in his family. The secretary said his voice was getting louder and angrier with each call. By the end of the school day, the district's legal team had taken over, intercepting all calls from Rick's number and documenting every single threat he made. They sent an email to all staff with clear instructions that if Rick showed up in person or tried to make contact through any channel, we were to immediately refer him to the legal office without engaging in any conversation. Over the weekend, I kept checking my phone expecting some kind of emergency, but everything stayed quiet. Monday morning, I got to the school early and waited near the front entrance. At 7:45, a white van pulled up with the shelter's logo on the side. Isabella and Paul climbed out with their backpacks, and the mother waved from the passenger seat before the van pulled away. Isabella walked past me into the building and I followed a few steps behind, giving her space but staying close enough to help if she needed it. At lunch, I watched her go through the line and load her tray with the usual items. When she got to the end, she grabbed 3 extra packets of crackers and shoved them into her jacket pocket with that same furtive movement I'd seen dozens of times before. I walked over and sat down next to her. She froze when she saw me, hand still in her pocket. I kept my voice gentle and told her she could have as many snacks as she wanted from my desk anytime. No need to hide them or save them anymore. She looked at me with those big worried eyes and asked if I was sure, if it was really okay. I nodded and said I kept a whole drawer full of granola bars and crackers and fruit snacks, just for kids who needed extra food, and she was welcome to take whatever she wanted whenever she wanted it. She pulled the crackers back out of her pocket slowly, and set them on her tray, then actually ate one right there in front of me. Paul started showing up 30 minutes before school started every single day that week. His teacher had enrolled him in the free breakfast program, and every morning he sat in the cafeteria eating scrambled eggs and toast and fruit. His teacher pulled me aside on Wednesday and said she'd noticed a huge difference already. Paul was staying awake during lessons, participating in activities, even smiling during story time yesterday, which was the first time she'd seen him look genuinely happy since the school year started. She said whatever intervention had happened was clearly working because this was a completely different kid. Rebecca scheduled a meeting with the mother at the shelter that Thursday afternoon. I didn't attend, but Rebecca filled me in later. The mother had already applied for emergency food assistance through the state, temporary cash aid to help cover basic expenses and childcare vouchers, so she could keep working both jobs. Her employers had been understanding about the schedule disruptions, and the shelter case manager was helping her search for subsidized housing in a safe neighborhood. The plan was to get them into permanent housing within 60 days if possible. 2 weeks after the shelter placement, I realized I was completely exhausted. Not physically tired, but emotionally drained in a way I hadn't experienced before. I kept thinking about Isabella counting to 8,000 to make the hunger feel floaty, about Paul pinching himself to stay awake, about the mother's neck covered in bruises. I scheduled a meeting with Rebecca just to talk through what I was feeling. She listened to everything and then said something that stuck with me. She said I'd done exactly what I was supposed to do by recognizing the signs and connecting the family to the right resources, but I wasn't responsible for solving all their problems or preventing every setback that might happen in the future. She reminded me about professional boundaries and said it was important to care about students without taking on their trauma as my own. During a routine check-in the following week, Isabella met with the school counselor for one of the regular safety assessments CPS required. The counselor came to find me afterward looking shaken. She said Isabella had disclosed that Rick used to choke her mom maybe 5 or 6 times, not just the ones she'd originally told me about. The counselor had immediately updated the safety plan and sent the new information to CPS and Larissa. She explained that this additional disclosure actually strengthened the case for the protective order hearing that was scheduled for next month, because it established a clear pattern of escalating violence over time. 3 weeks after the emergency order, the court hearing happened for a long-term protective order. The mother had to testify about everything, including the strangulation incidents, the financial control, Rick's threats to take the kids and disappear. She brought medical records showing the injuries, police reports from the welfare checks, all the school documentation we'd compiled over those weeks. The judge listened to everything and then granted a 3-year protective order. The order also required Rick to complete a batterer's intervention program before he could even petition to modify any of the terms. Larissa called Rebecca right after the hearing to share the news, and Rebecca immediately texted me. I was in the middle of teaching, but I excused myself for a minute and just stood in the hallway feeling this overwhelming sense of relief. One afternoon, about a month later, Isabella came to my classroom after school and pulled something from her backpack. It was one of those carefully wrapped food bundles she used to hoard, still intact in its napkin. She handed it to me and said she didn't need this one anymore because they had a whole kitchen at the new place. The shelter had helped her mother secure subsidized housing in a neighborhood on the other side of town, far from where Rick lived. They'd moved in over the weekend with donated furniture from a local charity, and the food bank had stocked their pantry with enough groceries to last 2 weeks. Isabella said they had a refrigerator without a lock and she could open it whenever she was hungry. 2 months after that terrifying lunchroom conversation when Isabella first told me about the hunger and the counting, I stood outside during recess and watched her actually play. She was running around with a group of other kids, laughing and chasing them in some game I couldn't quite follow. Paul ran up to me during lunch that same week and shoved a spelling test in my face covered in gold stars. His teacher had written, "Perfect score," across the top in red marker, and Paul was grinning, so wide I could see the gap where he'd lost a tooth. At pickup time, I saw the mother waiting in the designated parent area, no longer hiding in the car or rushing away before anyone could talk to her. She waved at me with a genuine smile, and I noticed she wasn't wearing a scarf or turtleneck despite the warm weather. Her neck was visible and clear. I waved back and watched Isabella and Paul climb into the car, both of them talking over each other about their day. I knew they weren't completely healed and probably wouldn't be for a long time. Trauma doesn't just disappear because you're finally safe. But standing there watching that car pull away with all 3 of them together and smiling, I knew they were going to be okay. They were finally, truly safe. All right, friends, that's where we'll leave it today. Sometimes the smallest acts of care have the biggest impact, right? Hit subscribe if you want more stories that restore your faith in humanity. Until next time, keep looking out for each other.